Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 3, Episode 22. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion. We will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. What's on the slate for this week? Well, the Supreme Court turns out to be a completely corrupt enterprise. And so what? Is it that the institution is corrupt? Or is it that we're just ignorant and we only realize now that that institution is corrupt? Like many of the things that we become aware of, dear listener, it's always been there, it's always been around, it's only the extent to which we recognized it. And the extent to which we recognized it can be a reflection on the fact that we are a bunch of oblivious assholes. And I went and saw The Sound of Freedom, and I will speak to it. Thank you all for listening. I really do appreciate it. Please give the podcast a like, a thumbs up, 5 stars, write a review. Please send to your friends far and wide. If you like what you hear, This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. Please consider supporting.
Act 1. So the Supreme Court is corrupt. Hasn't it always been?
Since starting this podcast, I've commented on numerous news stories. I have introduced the idea that yes, when we're exposed to things, particularly when they're nefarious, when they involve deceit, when they involve collusion, when they involve what we think is unethical and feel is unethical behavior, we have to question whether or not this is a moment in time or this is something that has permeated institutions, whether they be fascist, socialist, democratic, whether they be aristocratic, whether they be regal, whether they be economic, whether they be social, whether they be political, whether they be religious. What's come through me this week about all the revelations about the Supreme Court of the United States of America, I like getting into my ego and judging. And it's easy to do so when you believe that the things that you're experiencing in the moment in time that you're experiencing them, and maybe more to the point, that you're actually aware of them, well, that's when you can jump in your ego and judge the hell out of other people and judge the hell out of institutions. For the unaware, several stories have broke about the Supreme Court justices and their playtime that many of them have taken paid for trips from millionaires and billionaires, and it's bipartisan. I'm not going to get up here and wag a finger at the left or wag a finger at the right. You have as many of the left-leaning justices as you do the right-leaning justices using their seat as a Supreme Court justice as an opportunity to influence peddle, as an opportunity to accept gifts and make money. I know Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, has been the focus of this ire for the last, let's say, 60 days. Now there's revelations about, Scalia. I think everybody knew about Scalia. I mean, maybe you did not, dear listener, but Scalia died at this ranch in Texas. They called it a hunting lodge. I believe I speculated on this very podcast, I can't remember which episode, that this was one of those lodges in Texas that had endangered species, and that it was very hush-hush, but you could go and hunt endangered species on this ranch. It was the playground of millionaires. You just can't walk in as any bumpkin with a rifle on the back of your truck and say, I want to go and shoot at an endangered lion or an endangered gazelle. Not only did you have to have the money, but you had to have the public presence that you were a known quantity, that you were not going to tell anyone about what went on at this ranch. Well, Justice Scalia died there. Quick aside, this is the ranch where Dick Cheney shot that guy in the face with a shotgun. The guy who got shot in the face? Yeah, he went on TV and publicly apologized to Dick Cheney. That's the type of place this ranch is. As a Supreme Court justice, I don't remember him doing anything worthy of having millions of dollars such that he could pay for a membership to go to this place routinely, and he certainly was hobnobbing with people that he routinely heard cases, whether that be in industries that he was regulating or, more to the point, probably not regulating, whether that be on social issues that would impact different industries. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is now part of the party, having taken trips all over the world with millionaires and billionaires, many of whom had cases before the Supreme Court or had business before different courts. And the failure of the Supreme Court to take a case was just as much putting a finger on the scale of justice as deciding a case in one's favor. And to keep the pressure on the left, Sotomayor, in her book tours, going to these universities, different types of institutions, and having people on her staff who were using their time not to research cases that were before the Supreme Court, not to help write or edit or craft the ideas that would appear in the decisions that were rendered by Sotomayor. No, they were doing what Cuomo, our friend Andrew Cuomo in New York, ended up, well, one of many things that ended up sinking his ship. They were working on her books, and they were promoting, if not pressuring, institutions of higher education to buy her books, including her children's books. You don't buy the books, well, she might not come back here to lecture. She may not come back here to make an appearance at the law school. One of the few public ways that a Supreme Court justice can earn money on the side, so to speak, money outside of the salary that they're paid for their job, it is through books. This is why you see so many politicians, so many bureaucrats, they have these book deals. It's one of the easiest ways that they can make money publicly without triggering any ethics violations. In Sotomayor's case, yes, on its face, it's legitimate. She has the right to author and publish books and make money off of it. I don't know that she is ethically allowed to have her staff basically work on those books while they're supposed to be employed to work on matters before the Supreme Court, and then pressure public institutions, not just private institutions, but public institutions, to buy those books, lest she not show up, lest she not show her face there again. Where to start on all this? Where to start on all this and not be in my ego? First and foremost, it always struck me as odd. It was always discordant with me. I'm talking about when I was a young lawyer, 2, 3, 4 years out of law school, this attitude, maybe that's the right word, this culture that permeated many of the pockets of the legal industry whereby lawyers believe themselves to be this Archangel Michael bringing forth from his sheath the flaming sword of Gideon, such that justice will be served and righteousness, the substance of any true lawyer's gravitas, would be brought into the light in that sacred, if not hallowed, court of law. That sounds like hyperbole. It sounds like absolute and total nonsense to many of you. I've been in rooms where it wasn't a lawyer who was espousing this kind of rhetoric. I've been in rooms where it was the lawyers espousing this kind of rhetoric, and I'm looking around the room to kind of roll my eyes, and I notice that in doing so, I'd be the only one rolling my eyes. I would be identifying myself as a non-believer by not nodding my head, by not pounding my fist. Trying as much as I can to stay out of my ego in this story. I don't know the pressures of being a Supreme Court justice. I don't know the trials and tribulations, and I certainly don't know the temptations. And I've done several pieces over the course of the last few weeks that discuss temptation in a number of different ways. You look at people like, what's a recent piece? Dave Ramsey or Mehmet Oz. Has a billionaire ever come to me and said, hey, would you like to take a trip around the world for free, where I may only come and see you once every 2 to 3 days on my luxury yacht for a dinner, and you can enjoy all of the splendor of some of the most remote and beautiful parts of the world? Gee, it has nothing to do with the fact that I've got a case before the court, or I've got a case that could potentially come up to the court. what do you say to that? What it makes clear, and what we can all agree on, I hope, is that Supreme Court justices, although appointed for life, and in that appointment, the rationale being that they will be apolitical. Justices will be apolitical because they won't have to run for election. They don't have to worry about whether or not favoring one political party or another, favoring one kind of religious or social or economic position will compromise their seat on the court. They can be independent. Well, no one in Washington, D.C. is independent. And the overriding point I wanted to make to you, dear listener, is I don't know that anyone in Washington, D.C. ever was independent. I believe that having the separation of powers and having Supreme Court justices nominated for life is a counterbalance to the other two branches of government. It does not make that branch of government beyond reproach. It doesn't make that branch of government ethical, and it certainly does not alleviate that branch of government of the scrutiny of the people. I have regrets sometimes about leaving the law, some of the things that I really enjoyed about it. One of the things that I did not enjoy is going into courtroom after courtroom with a judge, and mind you, I have explained that many judges are completely overworked, they are understaffed, they have too many cases, they have too few people to help them work on them. Yet it is extremely frustrating when you see one of two things coming out of a courtroom. One, this judge has not read all of the pleadings, doesn't really know what's going on with the case. Or two, the judge does have an idea of what's going on with the case, has read some of the pleadings, and it has struck a political or a social or a religious chord in that judge, and they are going to, in a partisan fashion, rule one way or the other. Quick aside, there is a third element to the frustration that is being a lawyer that has to go in and out of court. You get a lot of these judges, if you go back and you research their history as attorneys, they were practicing law in certain practice groups, in certain firms. They're connected to many of the communities where lawyers that they were cozy with are now arguing cases in front of them. I remember when I was in college and I was playing flag football, and I saw one of the referees talking to a person on the opposing team, and as I approached them, they were making plans to play cards, and they were actually making plans to do more than play cards. It turns out they were hosting a poker tournament, and they were going to be the house. That's right, dear listener. They were business partners. Did I have a warm and fuzzy feeling that the contest I was about to participate in would be refereed in a fair and balanced way? No, I did not. The referee and the captain of the opposing flag football team were, for all intents and purposes, business partners. There were profanities thrown around. There was quite a lot of frustration and anger. It didn't end well for my team. You wax poetic as an attorney when you're going into a state courthouse, hell, even going into some of these small claim court cases, and you are undermined by what looks like nepotism or what looks like cronyism. You don't expect it on the highest court in the land, at the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And yet, it appears to be not only prevalent there, it may well be the standard that we have just now realized has been around for years, if not decades. Is it a problem because we just realized it's a problem, or has it always been a problem, and because we just realize it, it makes us look like dumbasses? Either way, it's not as big a deal as we make it out to be. It only requires us to take action. Well, I guess in that way, it is a huge deal because we're really not going to take action. Of course, every one of the branches of government is vying for power, and once you realize that one of them might be doing something to grab power or might be doing something unethical, you can always counterbalance in our system that branch of government. How does it work between the Supreme Court, the executive branch, the presidency, and the Congress? Well, if we don't like what the Supreme Court is doing, and many people claim that they don't, You go in, you elect legislators, and they write laws superseding the decisions made by the Supreme Court. We've allowed our Supreme Court to write laws because our legislative branch has been so piss poor in doing so. We've allowed our legislative branch to abdicate to the Supreme Court, to the judicial branch, the responsibility of writing laws. Well, it's not their responsibility. Looking at things from below instead of above, outside of my ego, perhaps this is great. Perhaps this is exactly what we needed, so that not only are we paying attention to the type of people that we send to Congress, that we demand of them more scrutiny of these Supreme Court justices in what we see as this unethical influence peddling. What's really coming through me, though, is that this isn't something new. The court is a political entity. It has political beings that are making up its membership. And frankly, its edicts aren't so sacrosanct. You can have many opinions about one Abraham Lincoln, positive and negative. One of my favorite Abraham Lincoln stories is when the Supreme Court came out, and a lot of people don't realize this, when the Supreme Court came out during the Civil War and said, hey, we've solved the problem. Slavery is legal in every state and every territory of the Union. There you have it. No more war. No more need for conflict. Slavery is legal not only in the slave states, but also in the free states and in the territories. Problem solved. And one President, Abraham Lincoln, came out and said, well, the court's made its ruling. Let's see them enforce it.
Act 2, I saw Sound of Freedom.
Earlier in this very podcast season, I noted that I'm not going to comment on a lot of the stories. I actually had to pause there because I was about to use a word associated with journalism, and most of these stories are not associated in any way with any true sense of journalism. I don't want to comment on these stories that are circulating through the 24-hour news cycle because you don't have enough information to truly form any basis, any real opinion. And generally, the information changes based on the narrative of the organization that's reporting on the story. I, too, as I'm sure you have, dear listener, have been exposed to some of the news cycle surrounding this movie, Sound of Freedom. Well, the difference between this movie and a news event that I can't really get next to, right? I can't go and do any independent reporting on many of the stories that are circulating in a 24-hour news cycle. I can go out and see a movie. If you are a long-time listener to the show, you know that I really don't like Hollywood, and most movies are pathetic. That's probably a complimentary term for me to give them based on how I feel. Most movies are pathetic. They are more for the average McDonald's type consumer, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It probably comes off that way. It's just that they're more fashioned to appeal to the broadest audience possible, to give them the satisfaction that they're looking for in a very temporal, in a very short-term manner. There aren't a lot of movies that are made that you could truly call them art. You could say that they were created by an artist, that this is the work of an auteur. Having said all of that, Sound of Freedom is not that. It is not the work of an artist. It is not something that you would say would be the brainchild of an auteur. It is, at its core, a very simple, yet very effective search and rescue thriller. And I did not come up with that term. I've actually heard it several times from several critics, both critics that really like the movie and really dislike the movie, that it's at its core a search and rescue thriller. If you were unaware, the movie was actually shot in 2018. It was a 20th Century Fox product. It was owned, or the rights were owned by 20th Century Fox. 20th Century Fox was bought by Disney. Disney decided not to release the film. They were just going to shelve it. So the producers actually had to buy the movie back from Disney and then go out and find another company to release it. And they found this studio called Angel Studio. And Angel Studio, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but basically they have a crowdsourced investing concept. So they have a bunch of people that they will go and screen movies for and say, if you like this movie well enough that we'll try to buy the rights and release it, we need to crowdsource the funds to do this. Sound of Freedom was one of the movies that the community believed was a winner. Quick comment on Disney not releasing this movie after the acquisition of 20th Century Fox. So Disney has been embroiled in controversy in a number of different ways, and many of the movies that they've produced have not only been controversial, and I'm going to put that term it's not really a term, put that word into quotes, controversial, because many of the movies they've released, they have an agenda. I don't think that that's a loaded term. They have an agenda. I don't think that anyone at Disney would deny that they're trying to incorporate more diversity into their films, that they're trying to incorporate different types of social or political or economic questions into their films. Now, how those social and economic and political questions are received, that's an entirely different story, and that's where the controversy stems from. I hate using this term. I think it is so reductionist. I am going to use it, though, because it's easy, and I've only got roughly 30 minutes that I'm going to commit to this podcast. Disney does have a woke angle in many of their films. That creates controversy, and it does not seem that when it comes to that type of controversy, Disney has any aversion. Please, follow me here, dear listener. There is a point. I'm going somewhere. Woke controversy doesn't seem to deter Disney. Let's talk about Disney's presence in China and what Disney will do in order to make a movie acceptable to the Chinese authorities such that it can be shown to a Chinese audience. They have no problems whatsoever complying with any whim of the Communist government of China in order to have one of their movies screened there, shown there. The greatest example of this is not the patch on the back of Maverick's jacket in the new Top Gun movie. I don't think that's the greatest example. The greatest example is the Star Wars movie where they had Asian characters introduced into that new Star Wars genre. We're talking about the 3 latest movies where Daisy What's-Her-Name was the lead. The movie poster that's shown for the film in China takes out the Finn character so that on the poster there is no black face as part of the cast. The black actor is completely removed from the poster. This Disney is more than willing to do in order to have the film shown in China. Controversy ensues, and rightfully so. Here we have Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox, looking through the film archive. What are the films that 20th Century Fox has on the shelf? What are the films that 20th Century Fox has in production? What are the films that 20th Century Fox is ready to release? And they see this film and they say, we're going to shelve it. Here's where your patience is rewarded, dear listener. I went and saw the film. There is nothing in this film that is so heinous, that is so difficult for an audience to follow, for an audience to watch, that the people at Disney who court controversy, let's just be clear, whether or not you agree with how that controversy is generated, you agree with what Disney does, you disagree with what Disney does. They are courting controversy by operating in the current manner that they are operating. And yet, they don't have the appetite to release a film like Sound of Freedom because it's too controversial. They don't like the message that it's conveying. This is not some great work of art. It's a very good film. I did not expect it to be as compelling as it was. The acting in it is good. Caviezel does a good job as the lead. All of the supporting actors do a very good job. The child actors do a very good job. Mild spoiler alert, although I was aware of this before I went to see the film, just based on some of the quote-unquote controversy that had been generated by the release of the movie. The movie has actual video from the raid that was the source material for this script. So what you were seeing on the screen, you inevitably see the video that was shot of the bust, the sting that brought down many of the people who were involved in this child trafficking ring. This movie is not unique. It's not this Hollywood story that actually accurately goes through and depicts every single second of what that sting entailed, of the life of the protagonist, Tim Ballard, his relationship with his job, how he courted all of the elements necessary in order to create this sting and to bring these people down. It's a Hollywood movie. When you see the words based on a true story, that's loosely based on a true story. No one's ever going to put that loosely word in front of that term, but it is loosely based on a true story. It's still Hollywood. I've made this point before, I'll make it again. Law and Order is a fun show to watch. You see the law in the first 20 minutes, you see the order in the last 20 minutes. Any of these procedurals that show what a detective goes through in a case or what lawyers do in litigating a case is boring as hell, because it's boring as hell. When you base television programs on true detective work, or you base television programs on true lawyers litigating cases, it's boring. That's why based on a true story means loosely based on a true story, so we could make it entertaining enough that you'll want to sit through it. Point being that none of the studios that would ever screen, that would ever release a movie that was based on a true story, they don't have any qualms on whether or not that true story is moderately accurate or completely inaccurate. If they believe the movie to be entertaining and that it will make money, they'll release it. And that begs the question, why would Disney not release this movie? What was it about this movie that Disney thought would be so problematic that it decided to shelve the movie? This is no conspiracy theory. I think it's plain and simple. Any movie around the topic of child trafficking, I feel Disney was internally conflicted. And I know that you have, dear listener, because again, I don't have kids. I'm the last guy to know. There is a ton of content criticizing Disney on the internet that it, as an organization, is participating in child exploitation. And if you look at the Disney content on the Disney Channel over the course of the last 20 years, it's hard to argue that point. There is a lot of content that sexualizes young children. My understanding is that Disney has moved away from this type of content. Therefore, there may have been internal discussions at Disney about whether or not this movie would court a topic that they have tried to distance themselves from over the course of the last maybe 5 years. Maybe that's even as long as 10 years. Given the success of the movie, it is strange that Disney decided not to release it. Compounding on that, the critical reaction, the popular culture reaction in the legacy media has been outright strange to me. This outrage over whether or not this movie is QAnon adjacent because it's dealing with a topic of child exploitation, of child slavery, of kidnapping children and turning them into sex slaves. And thus, because it addresses such a topic, it has to be QAnon adjacent. Let me try to make an analogy for you, dear listener, in the hypocrisy of such a position by anyone. The position being, so that I'm being clear, that because you speak to a topic that has also been spoken to by conspiracy theorists, that somehow you are part of their tribe. Whether or not you agree with our policy in Ukraine, the Ukrainians themselves have every right to defend their country. So if you are supportive of the war in Ukraine, you're supportive of the U.S. supporting financially and with its weapons the war in Ukraine, it's hard for me to argue that you don't have a foundation for taking such a position. The Ukrainians protecting their borders, protecting their sovereignty, that is a legitimate position. It just so happens that in eastern Ukraine, and it's been this way since the 1930s, there is a strong fascist presence. Putin wasn't wrong. Two things can be right at the same time. There is a strong fascist presence, Nazi presence in eastern Ukraine. And as we have learned over the course of the last year, that presence, that paramilitary, fascist, Nazi presence was incorporated into the standing army in order to defend the borders of Ukraine. when you are in such dire straits, you don't have time to vet people's allegiances. You need as many warm bodies as you can and people who can competently, if not at least willingly, go to the front lines in such a conflict. Now, would anyone who supports the war in Ukraine, supports the United States' economic and military support of the war in Ukraine, would any one of those folks posture themselves as a neo-Nazi, as a modern fascist, as Nazi adjacent? No. You can support the war in Ukraine, the U.S.'s military and economic assistance of the war in Ukraine, and be completely condemning of any fascist presence in eastern Ukraine or in the Ukrainian army. Likewise, you can go and see The Sound of Freedom. You can support the cause that it represents, an awareness, if not aversion, to child trafficking, and that it needs to have a more global, a more coordinated response in order to combat it. We are all too eager to put somebody else into a tribe when it's easy for us to construct the four walls of that tribe. I'd highly recommend that you go see The Sound of Freedom. Are you going to be blown away? Is it some revolutionary story? No. Is it an entertaining movie? Is it a well done, a well written, a well shot, well directed, well produced movie? Yes, it is. That there is any controversy surrounding its subject matter or that it's QAnon adjacent, it's generally the critics of this subject, the critics of the movie that are making these claims that it's QAnon adjacent. There's no content in the movie that you could say has a QAnon source. Maybe it's better or more accurate to say there's no subject matter in the movie that you could say is QAnon inspired. So it's an interesting controversy in that those that are speaking about it being controversial have created the controversy. There's no subject matter, there's no source material for the controversy. They have created the controversy and then condemned the movie for what? For that very controversy. Do you see the circular logic there? You create the controversy and then you condemn the thing for the very controversy that you created. Caviezel makes a plea at the end of the movie, and I don't think that this is a spoiler either. It's part of what you'd call a public service announcement that the movie can serve as the Uncle Tom's Cabin of child trafficking in the 21st century. And it just struck me, I was thinking the exact same thing as this PSA was coming on at the end of the movie, that this could be the Uncle Tom's Cabin that opens people's eyes to what child trafficking is in the 21st century. None of us wants to believe that in the society that we live that is more advanced than any society that we have in the course of human history can be so blind and can allow in its shadows to have something that's so nefarious as this organized child trafficking. You take children from very poor, impoverished areas of the world. There is little to no infrastructure in those countries to retrieve those children, particularly if you're trying to find those children in a global, not a nationwide, but a global search. I will sit here and admit to you that I know that some of the video of live kidnappings that are shown in the movie are probably cherry-picked. They are disturbing nonetheless. It does not take 100 such kidnappings that you should say, oh, now it's a problem. Just one, to see some of these kids in these third world countries being just grabbed off the streets and kidnapped, it's disturbing. That anyone could go and see this movie, The Sound of Freedom, and come away with another agenda, that it is somehow QAnon conspiracy theory, that it is somehow trying to glorify or exploit what child trafficking is, they're projecting. Let's get back to the concept. We very rarely interpret the world. We're just projecting who we are and how we see ourselves out onto the world. These criticisms of the film are less a commentary on the film itself and more a revelation of the critics themselves. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.